The leather glove hit the dirt before Katherine Devereaux could grab it, and the peregrine falcon perched on her fist launched skyward with a piercing cry that shattered the morning quiet across the plains of North Texas in the summer of 1878. She cursed under her breath, watching her most stubborn bird disappear into the endless blue above Dallas County. This was the third time this week that Artemis had decided freedom looked more appealing than the prospect of returning to the mews behind her small homestead on the outskirts of town. Katherine shielded her eyes from the climbing sun, her dark hair escaping its practical braid as she craned her neck to follow the falcon's path. At 24 years old, she had been working with birds of prey since she was barely tall enough to reach her father's workbench, but some days the creatures still humbled her with their wild spirits. Reckon that bird does not much care for your company today. The voice came from behind her, low and amused, carrying the dusty edge of a man who spent more time talking to horses than people. Katherine spun around to find a cowboy leaning against the split-rail fence that marked the boundary of her property. He was tall, built lean like most men who made their living in the saddle, with sun-darkened skin and hair the color of prairie grass in late autumn. His eyes, she noticed with some irritation at noticing at all, were the pale gray of winter sky. "Your observation skills are remarkable," Katherine said, her tone sharp enough to cut rope. "Perhaps you could put them to better use somewhere other than my property." The cowboy pushed away from the fence, raising both hands in a gesture of peace. His hat had seen better days, battered and stained with the honest wear of hard work rather than fashionable neglect. "Meant no offense, miss. I am Asher Irwin, foreman at the Double Creek Ranch about 10 miles west of here. I came looking for the bird woman, heard she lived out this way." Katherine studied him with the same careful assessment she used when approaching a new raptor. Asher Irwin held himself with quiet confidence, but there was something in the set of his shoulders that spoke of burdens carried without complaint. He met her gaze directly, neither challenging nor deferring, which she appreciated more than she cared to admit. "I am Katherine Devereaux," she said finally, moderating her tone. "Most people around Dallas know me as Kate. What business does a ranch foreman have with a falconer?" Asher glanced up at the sky where Artemis had vanished, then back at Katherine with an expression she could not quite read. "Heard you train birds to fly free. Teach them to hunt, to survive on their own, then let them go back to the wild if they choose it. That true?" "Sometimes," Katherine admitted. She bent to retrieve her fallen glove, brushing dust from the thick leather. "Birds of prey are not like horses or cattle. You cannot truly domesticate them. You can only convince them that cooperating with you serves their interests better than fighting or fleeing. Some birds I train for hunting, work with them for years in partnership. Others I rehabilitate from injuries and release when they are ready. What concern is it of yours?" The cowboy was quiet for a long moment, his attention fixed on the distant horizon where the grasslands rolled away toward the Trinity River. When he spoke again, his voice had lost its earlier lightness. "How did you learn to do that?" "To hold something precious without clutching so tight you strangle it. To care for something while knowing you might have to let it go." The question caught Katherine off guard. She had expected him to ask about using her birds for hunting rabbits that plagued the ranch grazing lands, or perhaps to request that she remove a hawk nest that was frightening the chickens. Instead, here stood this rough-handed cowboy asking her something philosophers might wrestle with over whiskey and tobacco. "You do not seem like a man interested in falconry," she said carefully. "I am not." Asher finally looked at her again, and Katherine saw genuine pain flickering behind his carefully controlled expression. but I am a man who needs to learn how to love something without destroying it in the process. Figured if you could teach birds to be free, you might could teach a person the same thing. Before Katherine could respond, a familiar cry echoed from above. Both of them looked up to see Artemis circling lower, riding the thermal currents with effortless grace. The falcon had returned on her own terms, as she always did eventually. Katherine raised her gloved fist and gave the soft whistle she had trained the bird to recognize as both greeting and invitation. Artemis stooped from her height with breathtaking speed, pulling up at the last moment to land on Katherine's offered arm with barely a whisper of impact. The falcon mantled her wings once, then settled, regarding Asher with one fierce golden eye while Katherine offered her a small piece of dried meat from the pouch at her belt. She came back because she chose to, Katherine told Asher quietly, stroking the falcon's breast feathers with one careful finger. Not because I commanded it or captured her. She hunted, flew as far and high as she pleased, and then returned because this place means safety and food and companionship to her. That is the only freedom worth having, the kind where you can leave but you choose to stay. Asher watched this exchange with an intensity that made Katherine's skin prickle with awareness. He nodded slowly, as if she had confirmed something he had hoped to hear. "Will you teach me?" "Teach you falconry," Katherine frowned. "That takes months, even years to learn properly." "No." He shook his head, taking a step closer, but stopping when Artemis roused her feathers in warning. "Teach me whatever it is you know about loving freely, about holding without grasping. I do not have years, but I will take whatever time you can spare and whatever wisdom you are willing to share." Katherine should have sent him away. She had work to do, 3 more birds to train that morning alone, and no shortage of tasks that came with maintaining a homestead largely by herself. Her father had died the previous winter, leaving her the property and his legacy of working with raptors, but none of his easy way with people. She preferred the company of her hawks and falcons to the complicated entanglements of human relationships. But something in Asher, Irwin's request, touched a nerve she had thought well protected. Here was a man humble enough to admit he needed help, brave enough to seek it from a stranger, and perceptive enough to recognize that the skills she used with her birds might translate to human matters of the heart. "Why?" she asked bluntly. What happened to make a grown man ride 10 miles to ask a question like that of someone he has never met? Asher removed his hat, running his fingers through his hair in a gesture that seemed more habit than purpose. His face, without the shadow of the brim, looked older than she had first judged, though he could not be more than 27 or 28. Hard living aged a man faster than calendar years. "I was married once," he said quietly. "Young and stupid, thought I knew what love meant. Sarah was 17, I was 22, and we thought passion was enough to build a life on. I loved her so fierce it burned, wanted to know where she was every minute, who she talked to, what she thought about. Kept her close because I was scared of losing her. Watched my own father do the same to my mother until she just seemed to fade away like morning mist. Sarah tried to leave me twice, and both times I convinced her to stay with promises I did not know how to keep." He paused, his jaw working as he stared at the hat in his hands. Katherine remained silent, sensing he needed to finish without interruption. 3 years ago, she took the mare I gave her for our first anniversary and rode out to visit her sister in Fort Worth. Road was not safe, everyone knew it, but I had been so suffocating that she would rather risk the journey than spend another day feeling trapped. Comanche raiding party caught her 5 miles outside of town. By the time we found her, it was too late to do anything but bury what was left. Katherine felt the words hit her chest like physical blows. "I am sorry," she said, knowing the words were inadequate but offering them anyway. "Not looking for sympathy," Asher said roughly. "Looking for change. I killed her sure as if I had pulled a trigger. Not with violence, but with the kind of love that suffocates instead of uplifts. I see it in other men around me, grabbing hold of their wives and children like possessions instead of people. Watched my boss at the ranch drive his own son away last month because he could not let the boy make his own choices. I am tired of seeing love twisted into something ugly and selfish. So when I heard about you and what you do with these birds, I thought maybe there was something to learn." Katherine shifted Artemis to her perch, a portable stand she had set up near the fence for exactly this purpose. The falcon settled immediately, content now that she had been fed and acknowledged. Katherine stripped off her glove and turned to face Asher directly. "Falconry is not going to solve your problems," she said firmly. "Birds are not people. I know that. And learning to love freely, as you put it, is not something I can teach you in a few lessons like I might teach you to train a hawk to the lure. I know that too." "Then what exactly are you asking of me, Mr. Irwin?" He met her eyes again, and she saw desperation there mixed with determination. "Let me come here and work. Help you with whatever needs doing around your homestead. In exchange, let me watch how you do what you do. Talk to me about your birds, about freedom and trust and partnership. Maybe some of it will take root in this thick skull of mine. Maybe I will learn something that makes me fit to someday try again at the things I failed at before." It was the most unusual proposition Katherine had ever received. She thought of her father, who had taught her that every creature deserved respect and space to be itself. She thought of the birds she worked with daily, each one a lesson in the balance between connection and freedom. She thought of her own isolation, chosen after watching her mother die young from hard work and harder circumstances, after deciding that keeping her heart to herself was safer than risking it on another person. "I pay nothing," she said finally. "I can feed you a meal when you come, but I have no money for wages." Asher's face transformed with a smile that softened all its harsh lines. "Not asking for wages, just asking for a chance to learn something I should have known long before now." "Mornings," Katherine continued, ignoring the odd flutter in her chest at his smile. "I work with the birds at dawn and through the early hours. If you can be here by first light 3 times a week, I will tolerate your presence and answer your questions if they are not stupid. Fair enough. And if you do anything to disturb or frighten my birds, our arrangement ends immediately. Understood? Fine then." Katherine crossed her arms, suddenly uncertain why she had agreed to this strange bargain. "Tomorrow is Saturday. Be here at dawn, ready to work and to keep your mouth shut when I am concentrating." Asher settled his battered hat back on his head and nodded once, a gesture that seemed to seal some unspoken agreement between them. He turned to leave, then paused at the fence. "Thank you, Miss Devereaux. I will not waste your time or test your patience more than necessary." Katherine watched him walk to where his horse was ground tied in the shade of a cottonwood tree, mount with the easy grace of a man who practically lived in the saddle, and ride away toward the west. Only when he had disappeared from view did she allow herself to wonder what exactly she had just agreed to and whether she would come to regret it. Artemis gave a soft chirp from her perch, and Katherine returned to the familiar comfort of her work, trying to ignore the persistent feeling that something in her carefully ordered life had just shifted in a direction she could not quite name. True to his word, Asher appeared the next morning just as the first gray light was bleeding into the eastern sky. Katherine, who had been awake for an hour already preparing food and equipment, heard his horse approaching and felt an inexplicable flutter of nervousness that annoyed her immensely. "You are punctual," she called out, not turning from where she was cutting fresh meat into training-sized portions. "Used to getting up before the roosters," Asher replied, dismounting and tying his horse securely. He had traded yesterday's dusty trail clothes for a cleaner shirt and vest, though both still bore the honest wear of a working man. "Where do you want me?" Katherine finally looked at him, noting the genuine eagerness in his expression despite the early hour. "Follow me. Stay quiet, move slowly, and for the love of all that is reasonable, do not try to touch any of the birds without my explicit permission." She led him behind her small house to the mews, a series of weathering areas and indoor housing she and her father had built over the years. Currently, she had 6 birds in various stages of training or rehabilitation. Besides Artemis, there was a red-tailed hawk named Brutus who was learning to hunt from the glove, a young kestrel with a healed broken wing who would be released next month, 2 barn owls she kept for rodent control, and a golden eagle named Zenobia who had been her father's bird and was too old and imprinted to ever return to the wild. Asher stopped dead when he saw Zenobia, his eyes widening. The eagle was enormous, her wingspan reaching nearly 7 feet when she roused. She regarded the newcomer with regal disdain from her elevated perch. "That is Zenobia," Katherine said softly. "She is 23 years old and has been with my family since she was taken from a nest as a chick after her mother was killed by hunters. She is imprinted on humans, meaning she sees people as her species. She could not survive in the wild now even if I released her. This is the consequence of interfering too early or too completely in a wild creature's life. You rob them of their true nature and leave them dependent on you forever." Asher absorbed this information silently, his gaze moving from Zenobia to the other birds and back. "Your father kept her." "Yes. He always said she was his greatest failure and his most important teacher. She taught him that love without wisdom could cripple as surely as any physical injury. After Zenobia, he never took a bird from the wild that did not need help. Everything he did was aimed at returning them to their natural lives, not binding them to his." "But she is magnificent," Asher said, wonder clear in his voice. "She is," Katherine agreed. "And she is a prisoner, even if her cage is comfortable and her keeper kind. My father loved her, and she loved him in her way, but he stole her chance to be what she was meant to be. That guilt never left him." The lesson was not subtle, and Katherine watched Asher register it with a slight flinch. Good. If he wanted to learn, he needed to understand the stakes and the consequences of holding too tight. The next hours passed in quiet industry. Katherine showed Asher how to prepare the equipment, how to check each bird for signs of illness or injury, how to clean the mews without causing distress. He followed her instructions precisely, moving with surprising gentleness for a man with such weathered, capable hands. He asked questions that showed he was thinking rather than just following orders, and he never once showed impatience when Katherine made him repeat a task, because he had not done it exactly right the first time. When the sun was fully up and starting to heat the Texas air, Katherine brought out Brutus, the red-tailed hawk she was currently training to hunt. The bird was 2 years old in his prime, and sharp as broken glass in both temperament and talons. "Brutus was brought to me by a farmer whose barn cat had gotten to him," Katherine explained as she transferred the hawk to her glove with practiced ease. "Gashed his leg badly enough that infection set in. By the time I got him healthy, he had been captive for 3 months and forgotten most of his hunting skills. I have been working with him for 6 weeks now, teaching him to take prey from the lure and building his strength back up. Another month and he will be ready to choose." "Choose?" Asher asked, keeping his distance as Katherine had instructed. "Whether to stay or go. I will start giving him longer flights, more freedom. If he returns for the food and companionship, I may continue working with him as a hunting partner. If he stops coming back, that means he has remembered who he really is and has no further need of me. Either way, he will be whole again. That is the goal. Katherine carried Brutus out to the open area near her fence, far from any trees or structures that might interfere. Asher followed at a respectful distance, watching as she attached a long creance line to the hawk's jesses with practiced efficiency. The bird mantled its wings and chittered softly, eager to fly. "This is where trust is built," Katherine said, raising her voice slightly so Asher could hear her clearly. "I am going to let him fly the length of this line. He will reach the end and realize he cannot go further. His instinct will be to fight it. My job is to bring him back gently, reward him for returning, and gradually teach him that coming back brings good things rather than restraint." She launched Brutus with a smooth extension of her arm, and the hawk took to the air with powerful wing beats. Asher watched in evident fascination as the bird flew the full length of the creance, hit the limit, and began to bait violently against the restraint. Katherine worked the line with patient skill, gradually drawing the hawk back while speaking to him in a low, soothing tone that Asher had to strain to hear. When Brutus finally settled back on her glove, Katherine rewarded him with choice meat and continued speaking softly while he ate. The hawk's aggression faded, replaced by the focused calm of a predator enjoying a successful hunt. "You let him fight it," Asher observed once Katherine had returned Brutus to his perch. "Of course. If I yanked him back at the first sign of resistance, I would teach him that returning means punishment and constraint. By letting him feel the limit but not forcing him to yield, he learns the boundary exists but is not cruel. Eventually, he will understand that staying within that boundary by choice brings better results than fighting against it. That is the difference between training and breaking. Breaking creates obedience through fear. Training creates cooperation through understanding." Asher nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. Like the difference between a man who controls his wife with threats and one who earns her respect by giving her reason to stay. Katherine felt a flicker of approval at his quick understanding. Similar, though comparing women to hawks is apt to get you slapped by anyone with sense. People have more complex needs than birds, but the principle holds. Control breeds resistance. Trust breeds cooperation. They worked through the rest of the morning in this fashion, Katherine demonstrating various aspects of her craft, while Asher watched and occasionally asked questions that showed he was drawing parallels to human relationships. When the heat became oppressive, Katherine led them back to her house and produced a simple meal of bread, cheese, and cold meat that they ate on her small porch overlooking the prairie. "Your father taught you all this?" Asher asked between bites. "He did. He learned it from a falconer he met during his time in the army, before I was born. Became obsessed with it, said it was the most honest form of relationship he had ever seen between human and animal. When he left the service, he brought that knowledge back to Texas and built this place. My mother thought he was crazy at first, but she came around." Katherine's expression softened with memory. "She did. She saw how much joy it brought him, how much peace, and she saw that the principles he applied to his birds, he also applied to her and to me. He never demanded we be anything other than what we were, never tried to make us fit some notion he had in his head. He loved us enough to let us be free, even when that freedom scared him. He sounds like a good man. He was the best man I ever knew." Katherine's throat tightened unexpectedly. The loss was still fresh enough to ache. "He died last December, pneumonia that came on fast. By the time we realized how serious it was, there was nothing to be done. He died here in his own bed with Zenobia on her perch where he could see her. His last words to me were to never let fear make me cage something I loved. Asher was quiet for a long moment, his food forgotten. I am sorry for your loss, and grateful for what he taught you, which you are now sharing with me. They sat in companionable silence after that, the only sounds the distant cry of a hawk riding the thermals and the rustle of wind through the dry grass. Katherine found herself surprisingly comfortable with this rough cowboy's presence, with his quiet attention and lack of false charm. He did not fill the silence with empty chatter, or try to impress her with exaggerated tales of his own importance. He simply sat and observed and thought about what he had seen. When he finally rose to leave, promising to return on Monday morning, Katherine walked him to where his horse waited in the shade. "You did well today," she told him. "You listened more than you talked, which is rarer than it should be." Asher smiled at that, and Katherine noted again how it transformed his weathered face into something almost handsome. "Figured I should watch and learn before presuming to speak. You have knowledge I need, so I am in no position to do anything but pay attention and be grateful." After he rode away, Katherine returned to her birds and her work, trying to ignore the fact that she was already looking forward to Monday morning in a way that had nothing to do with falconry, and everything to do with pale gray eyes, and a voice that carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom. The weeks that followed fell into a rhythm that became the framework of Katherine's days. Asher arrived 3 mornings each week, sometimes 4 if his duties at the ranch allowed, and threw himself into whatever tasks Katherine set before him. He cleaned mews, prepared food, repaired equipment, and gradually, under her watchful eye, began to interact directly with the birds themselves. His first time handling Artemis was nearly a disaster. The falcon, temperamental as always, took exception to his unfamiliar presence on Katherine's glove and baited violently, very nearly driving her talons into his unprotected arm. Asher froze, fighting every instinct that must have been screaming at him to pull away, and waited while Katherine carefully secured the bird and removed her to a safe perch. "You did the right thing," Katherine told him once Artemis was settled. "Pulling away would have caused more damage and taught her that aggression works. Staying still, even though it clearly cost you, showed her that you are not a threat." "Felt like I was about to lose an arm," Asher admitted, his voice only slightly unsteady. "You might have if I had been slower." "Artemis is not cruel, but she is fierce and she does not trust easily. Rather like her keeper, truth be told." Asher looked at Katherine then with an expression she could not quite decipher. "Cannot fault a creature for being careful with trust. It is a valuable thing, should not be given lightly." As summer deepened into early autumn, Katherine found herself sharing more than just technical knowledge. They talked during their work, conversations that meandered from falconry to philosophy to the small details of their individual lives. She learned that Asher had been born in Oklahoma Territory, that his father had died when he was 15, leaving him to support his mother and 3 younger sisters through whatever work he could find. He had drifted into Texas 5 years ago, following the cattle drives, and eventually settled into the foreman position at Double Creek Ranch because it paid steady wages and gave him a measure of stability he had never known before. "You send money to your mother and sisters?" Katherine asked one morning while they were waiting for the young kestrel to finish eating before beginning flight training. "Mother died 4 years back," Asher said quietly. "Same winter Sarah left. My sisters are all married now, settled with families of their own. I see them once or twice a year when I can manage the trip. They worried about me after Sarah died, thought I might do something stupid in my grief. Took some convincing to make them understand I was not planning to eat a bullet, just trying to figure out how to be a better man. Are you a better man than you were? He considered the question seriously, watching the kestrel preen her feathers in the morning sun. Maybe. I am more aware of my own failings, which I suppose is a start. I watch myself around the younger hands at the ranch now. Notice when I am being too controlling or expecting them to read my mind instead of speaking plain. Caught myself last week about to tear into a kid for making a mistake, then remembered watching you with Brutus when he refused the lure 3 times in a row. You did not get angry, just patient. Figured if you could show that kind of restraint with a hawk, I could manage it with a 16-year-old boy who was only trying his best. Katherine felt something warm unfold in her chest at his words. That must have taken considerable effort. Most men I have met would rather die than admit they might be wrong about anything. Most men are idiots, Asher said with a slight grin. Present company historically included, but I am trying to be less of one, which seems like a worthwhile goal. By October, the young kestrel was ready for release. Katherine had been preparing for weeks, giving the bird longer and longer flights on the creents, until she was certain its hunting skills had fully returned. The final step was to remove all restraints and let the small falcon make her own choice about her future. They performed the release on a cool morning with the sky so blue it hurt to look at directly. Asher had arrived early, sensing without being told that this was an important day. He stood quietly beside Katherine as she made her final checks of the kestrel's condition, ensuring the bird was healthy and strong and ready for whatever came next. She might not come back, Katherine said, more to herself than to Asher. That is the point, really. If she does not need me anymore, then I have succeeded. Does that not hurt? Asher asked softly. Putting all that time and care into something only to watch it fly away. Katherine stroked the kestrel's breast feathers one last time, memorizing the feel of the small, fierce heart beating under her fingertips. It hurts, and it does not. The hurt is selfish, the part of me that wants to keep her because I have grown fond of her. But the joy of knowing she is whole and free and capable of surviving on her own terms, that outweighs any sadness I might feel at her leaving. This is what I worked for. This is the whole point. She walked out into the open prairie, Asher following a few steps behind. When she had found a spot that felt right, Katherine raised her arm and said a simple goodbye to the kestrel. The bird seemed to hesitate for just a moment, then launched herself into the air with a cry that sounded like pure exhilaration. They watched her climb higher and higher, circling once over Katherine's homestead as if memorizing the location, then striking out to the south with powerful wing beats that quickly carried her out of sight. Katherine stood with her arm still raised long after the bird had vanished, her throat tight with the bittersweet ache of successful release. She is free, she finally said, lowering her arm and turning to find Asher watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. She will hunt and mate and live as she was meant to live. That is worth any amount of temporary sadness. You are remarkable, Asher said quietly. You know that. The way you love these creatures without trying to possess them. The way you give everything to their well-being and then let them go without resentment. That is what I have been trying to learn, but watching you actually do it is something else entirely. Katherine felt heat rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the October sun. I am not remarkable. I am just doing what my father taught me. You are remarkable, Asher repeated, taking a step closer. And I think I have been a fool for acting like I came here only to learn about birds. Katherine's heart began to pound in a way that was both terrifying and thrilling. What do you mean? I mean that somewhere between that first morning and now, This stopped being about falconry lessons and started being about wanting to be near you as much as possible. I mean that I think about you when I should be thinking about herd rotations and fence repairs. I mean that I have learned more from you than how to handle a hawk, and the most important lesson is that I might be capable of loving someone without destroying them in the process. He paused, his gray eyes searching her face. If you were willing to let me try. Katherine should have stepped back, should have reminded him that she had agreed to teach him about birds, not to entangle her life with his. She had been safe in her solitude, protected by her walls of careful distance. But standing there with the Texas wind tugging at her hair and the ghost of the kestrel's freedom still ringing in her ears, she found she did not want to be safe anymore. I am not easy to love, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I am used to my own company and my own ways. I do not bend easily or compromise without reason. I would not expect you to, Asher replied. I am not looking for someone to mold into whatever shape I find convenient. I am looking for someone who will be exactly who they are while I try to be worthy of standing beside them. That sounds fine in theory, Katherine said, though her resolve was crumbling with every word. But people are more complicated than birds. There is more room for hurt and misunderstanding. I know. Asher reached out slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, and took her hand in his. His palm was calloused and warm, his grip firm but not constraining. But I also know that I have spent months watching you teach creatures to trust again after they had been hurt. Watching you build partnerships based on respect and freedom and choice. If you can do that with hawks and falcons, maybe we can figure out how to do it with each other. If you are willing. Katherine looked down at their joined hands, then back up at his face, reading sincerity in every line. She thought of her father's final words, about not letting fear cage what she loved. She thought of the kestrel disappearing into the southern sky, free because Katherine had done the hard work of healing without binding. She thought of all the weeks of watching Asher prove himself through action rather than empty promises. I am willing, she said finally, and felt something tight in her chest loosen at the admission. But you should know that if you try to control me or limit me or make me smaller to fit into your life, I will send you away and not look back. I will not be suffocated, not even by someone I care for. I would not ask you to be, Asher said fervently. And if you ever feel like I am slipping back into old patterns, you tell me immediately. I cannot fix what I do not know is broken. Deal, deal. Katherine squeezed his hand, surprised by how right it felt to be touching him this way, to be allowing this connection. So what now? Asher smiled, and Katherine felt her heart do something complicated and wonderful in response. Now I would very much like to kiss you, if you have no objections to the idea. Katherine had been kissed before. Awkward fumbling attempts by boys in her youth, who thought passion meant force and enthusiasm. This was nothing like those experiences. Asher kissed her the way he did everything else, with careful attention and patient thoroughness that made her feel both cherished and free. His hands cradled her face gently, his lips warm and questioning against hers, waiting for her response before deepening the kiss into something that left them both breathing hard when they finally pulled apart. That was considerably better than adequate, Katherine managed, her voice unsteady. Asher laughed, the sound rich and genuine. High praise indeed. Should I take that to mean you would not be opposed to further experiments along those lines? You should take that to mean that if you stop kissing me in the next few seconds, I am going to reconsider this entire arrangement. He kissed her again, and then again, until they were both laughing breathlessly and Katherine had to lean against him for support because her knees had apparently forgotten their primary function. They stood wrapped in each other's arms as the morning stretched toward noon, trading kisses and quiet words and beginning to build something neither of them had quite dared to hope for. In the weeks that followed, Asher's visits took on a new dimension alongside the continued falconry work. He courted Katherine with the same patient determination he had shown in learning to handle her birds, bringing her small gifts that showed he paid attention to what mattered to her. A book on raptor medicine that had cost him 2 weeks' wages. Leather scraps of the highest quality for making new jesses and gloves. His help in repairing the roof of her mews before the winter rains could damage the structure. But more than gifts, he gave her freedom. He never assumed she wanted company without asking first. He never showed up unannounced or acted possessive when she spent days absorbed in her work without sending word to him. He made it clear through actions and words that he was choosing to be with her, not because he needed to possess her, but because being near her made him want to be the best version of himself. Katherine, who had spent years guarding her heart behind walls of careful independence, found those walls crumbling in the face of such steady, generous attention. She caught herself thinking of Asher during the day, wondering what he was doing at the ranch, looking forward to his next visit with an eagerness that would have alarmed her if it did not feel so right. She began riding into Dallas on occasion to meet him when his work kept him from visiting her homestead, spending afternoons together walking the dusty streets or sharing meals at the small restaurant near the courthouse. People talked, of course. The bird woman and the ranch foreman made unlikely companions in the eyes of Dallas society, such as it was. But Katherine had never cared much for other people's opinions, and Asher seemed to find the gossip more amusing than concerning. "Let them talk," he said one evening as they sat on her porch watching the sun set in shades of orange and gold. "They are just jealous that we figured out something most of them never will." "What is that?" Katherine asked, leaning against his shoulder with a contentment she had not known she was capable of feeling. That the best kind of love is the kind that makes you more yourself, not less. That holding tight enough to strangle is not devotion, it is fear. And that the people worth loving are the ones who could leave but choose to stay. Katherine tilted her face up to kiss him, tasting the truth of his words and the depth of feeling behind them. "You have learned well, Cowboy. I had an excellent teacher," he murmured against her lips. "Though I confess my motivations for attending lessons may not have been entirely pure." "Oh, and when exactly did learning about falconry become secondary to flirting with the falconer?" Asher pretended to think about it, his expression comically serious. "I would say approximately 17 seconds after I first saw you standing in your yard cursing at the sky. Something about the way you looked, fierce and focused, and completely unbothered by whether anyone was watching. I thought to myself, now there is a woman worth knowing. Everything after that was just finding excuses to be near you long enough that you might consider tolerating my presence." Katherine laughed, the sound surprised out of her. "You are ridiculous." "I am," he agreed cheerfully. "But I am yours if you want me, which is all I really care about these days." Winter came to North Texas with cold winds and occasional freezing rain that made outdoor work with the birds more challenging. Katherine had insisted that Asher stop making the long ride to her homestead during the worst weather, worried about his safety on the treacherous roads. He had reluctantly agreed, but showed up the moment conditions improved, sometimes before, desperate to make sure she had weathered the storm safely. It was during one of these winter visits, with ice still clinging to the bare tree branches and their breath fogging in the cold air, that Asher brought up the subject of the future. They were in the mews, checking on the birds who had been confined during the freeze. Zenobia clicked her beak softly when Asher approached, having grown accustomed to his presence over the months. He reached out carefully, as Katherine had taught him, and stroked the eagle's breast feathers with the gentle reverence he showed all her birds now. "I have been offered a position," he said quietly, not looking at Katherine. "The owner of Double Creek is getting older, thinking about stepping back. He offered to sell me a partnership in the ranch, make me part owner instead of just foreman." Katherine's heart clenched with instant, irrational fear. "That is wonderful," she managed, forcing enthusiasm into her voice. "You have worked hard for such an opportunity." "It is," Asher agreed. He finished checking Zenobia and turned to face Katherine directly. "But it would mean putting down real roots here, committing to staying in Dallas County for the foreseeable future. And before I give him an answer, I need to know if that is something you would want too." "What do you mean?" Katherine asked, though she suspected she knew exactly what he meant, and the knowledge terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. Asher took both her hands in his expression more serious than she had ever seen it. "I mean that I am in love with you, Kate. Completely, permanently, in the kind of way that has nothing to do with possession and everything to do with partnership. I want to build a life with you, if that is what you want too. Want to wake up beside you and work beside you and grow old beside you. But I will not do it by trapping you or demanding you give up anything that matters to you. So I am asking, plain and clear, whether you would consider marrying me and building something together that honors both of our needs and dreams." Katherine's eyes burned with unexpected tears. "I love you too," she said, her voice breaking slightly on the words. "I did not expect to, did not think I wanted to, but somewhere between teaching you about birds and learning about you, I fell completely in love. And yes, I want to build a life with you. Want to merge your dreams with mine and see what we can create together." Asher pulled her into a kiss that was both celebration and promise, holding her close but not tight, cherishing but not constraining. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers and laughed shakily. "I was more nervous asking you that than I have been about anything in my entire life," he admitted. "Kept thinking about all the ways I could mess this up, all the reasons you might say no." "I almost did say no," Katherine confessed. "The scared part of me that wants to stay safe behind these walls wanted to send you away. But then I remembered the kestrel, how she flew away and it hurt but it was right. And I thought about how you have never once tried to clip my wings or cage me in. You have only ever helped me fly higher. How could I possibly say no to someone who loves me like that?" They married in January of 1879. A simple ceremony in Dallas with only a handful of witnesses, including Asher's boss from the ranch and Katherine's neighbor who had known her father. Katherine wore a practical dress of deep blue rather than white, and Asher wore his best shirt and vest with his hair slicked back and his boots polished to a shine. The preacher who performed the ceremony seemed mildly confused by the vows they had written themselves, which included promises about freedom and trust, and never letting fear dictate their actions. But he declared them married with only minor stumbling, and Asher kissed Katherine while the small gathering applauded, and a pair of hawks circled overhead in what Katherine chose to interpret as a good omen. Rather than moving Katherine away from her homestead, they agreed that Asher would move in with her while maintaining his partnership position at the ranch. The Double Creek land adjoined her property on the west side anyway, making it easy for him to ride between both locations as needed. It required compromise and adjustment from both of them, learning to share space and negotiate differences. But they approached it with the same principles Katherine had used in training her birds. They talked openly about needs and boundaries. They gave each other space when required and came together with joy rather than obligation. They recognized that being married did not mean becoming one person, but rather two individuals choosing to walk parallel paths that occasionally intersected. It was not always easy. Asher had moments where his old protective instincts flared up, where he wanted to know where Katherine was, and what she was doing in ways that felt controlling rather than caring. Katherine had moments where her hard-won independence made her reject help she actually needed, because she was afraid that accepting it meant giving up some essential part of herself. But they had learned how to navigate these moments, how to call them out gently and course correct before small issues became large resentments. Asher would catch himself being overbearing and apologize, giving Katherine space until she sought him out again. Katherine would recognize when her defensiveness was hurting rather than protecting her, and soften enough to let him in. By summer, they had found a rhythm that worked. Katherine continued her falconry work, taking on students occasionally who wanted to learn the art properly. Asher ran his portion of the Double Creek Ranch with skill and fairness that earned him respect from the other ranchers in the area. Together, they began breeding and training horses using principles adapted from Katherine's work with birds, creating mounts known throughout North Texas for their responsiveness and spirit. On a hot afternoon in August, nearly a year after they had first met, Katherine found Asher sitting on the porch watching Artemis hunt in the field beyond the house. The falcon had stayed, as she often did, returning each evening to roost in the mews even though Katherine kept no barriers that would prevent her from leaving permanently. It was partnership by choice, the kind that Katherine valued most. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, settling beside him and taking his hand. "Thinking about the first day I came here," Asher said, pulling her against his side. "How desperate I was to learn something I did not even know how to name properly. How you could have sent me away, but chose to take a chance on a broken-down cowboy with more questions than sense." "You were not broken," Katherine protested. "You were learning and growing, which are different things entirely. Maybe." He kissed the top of her head, a gesture of casual affection that still made Katherine's heart flutter even after months of marriage. "But I know for certain that meeting you, learning from you, loving you, these have been the most important things I have ever done. You taught me that love does not have to hurt or constrain or diminish, that it can be the thing that sets both people free to become who they are meant to be." Katherine felt tears prick her eyes at the simple honesty in his words. "You taught me that not everyone wants to clip wings or build cages, that some people understand that the only love worth having is the kind freely given and freely received." They sat together as the sun tracked across the sky, watching Artemis dance through the thermals, comfortable in the silence and in each other's presence. It was, Katherine thought, exactly what her father had tried to teach her all those years ago. This balance between connection and freedom, between holding on and letting go, between loving fiercely and loving wisely. As autumn arrived again, marking the turning of the seasons and the passage of time, Katherine began to suspect she was carrying a child. She waited until she was certain before telling Asher, unsure how he would react to this new development that would change everything they had built together. She chose to tell him while they were working with a new hawk, a young bird still learning to trust the glove. They were in the field behind the house, the October air crisp and clean, the sky the impossible blue that only came in fall. "I need to tell you something," Katherine said, watching the hawk rather than Asher's face because she was suddenly nervous in a way she had not expected. "That sounds ominous." But his tone was light, not worried. "I am pregnant, about 2 months along if my calculations are correct. The baby should arrive in late spring." She finally looked at him and saw his face cycle through surprise, joy, and then something more complicated that might have been fear. "Are you happy about it?" he asked carefully. "I am," Katherine said honestly. "Scared too, because this is unknown territory and I have no idea if I will be any good at it. But yes, happy." "Are you?" Asher set down the equipment he had been holding and pulled Katherine into a careful embrace. "I am terrified," he admitted against her hair. "Terrified I will mess it up the way I have messed up so many things before. Terrified I will be too controlling or too distant or some awful combination of both. But underneath the terror, yes, I am happy. Hopeful that maybe we can raise this child with the wisdom you have shown me. Teach them about freedom and trust and love that does not cage." Katherine held him tighter, feeling his fear because it matched her own, but also feeling the foundation of trust and communication they had spent more than a year building together. "We will figure it out together," she promised, "just like we have figured out everything else. And if we start going wrong, we will talk about it and adjust course before we do permanent damage. That is what we do, remember. We learn and we grow and we give each other room to be imperfect while still trying to be better." "When did you get so wise?" Asher asked, pulling back to look at her face. "I have always been wise," Katherine informed him with mock severity. "You just were not paying close enough attention." He laughed and kissed her, and the young hawk on the perch nearby gave a soft chirp, as if commenting on the absurdity of humans and their emotional displays. They returned to their work with the bird, but something had shifted subtly, the shape of their future expanding to include this new person who would join their carefully built partnership. Katherine's pregnancy progressed smoothly through the winter months. She continued working with her birds until her changing balance made handling the larger raptors unsafe, then shifted to focusing on the smaller species and the administrative aspects of her breeding program. Asher hovered protectively at first, wanting to wrap her in cotton wool and prevent any possible harm, until Katherine reminded him firmly that she was pregnant, not made of glass. "I need you to trust me to know my own limits," she told him after he had tried to prevent her from lifting a perfectly reasonable weight. "If I need help, I will ask for it. But I will not be treated like an invalid for the next several months. That is not the kind of partnership we agreed to." Asher had apologized immediately, recognizing his own fear driving him toward the controlling behavior he had worked so hard to leave behind. They talked through it that evening, establishing guidelines that balanced his need to help with her need for autonomy. It was not the last difficult conversation they would have during the pregnancy, but each one reinforced their commitment to communication and mutual respect. In May of 1880, during a spring so beautiful it seemed designed specifically to welcome new life, Katherine gave birth to a son. The labor was long and difficult, hours of pain that left her exhausted and wrung out. But when the midwife finally placed the squalling infant in her arms, Katherine felt a surge of love so fierce it nearly stopped her heart. Asher, who had spent the labor pacing outside like a caged animal, came in at Katherine's call and stood frozen at the sight of his wife and child. His face was wet with tears. He made no attempt to hide as he carefully sat on the edge of the bed and reached out to touch the baby's impossibly tiny hand. "He is perfect," Asher whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Kate, he is absolutely perfect. What should we name him?" They had discussed names during the pregnancy, but never settled on anything definite, both of them superstitious about making plans before the baby arrived safely. Katherine looked down at her son, his face scrunched and red but already showing hints of his father's features, and thought of all the lessons she had learned from her birds about freedom and trust. "Thomas," she said finally, "after my father. Thomas Michael Irwin, if that suits you." "It suits me perfectly," Asher agreed. He leaned in to kiss Catherine's forehead, then the baby's, his movements gentle and reverent. "Hello, Thomas. Welcome to your strange and wonderful family." Learning to be parents proved every bit as challenging as Katherine had feared, but also more rewarding than she could have imagined. Thomas was a good baby overall, healthy and alert, but he still required constant attention and care that left both Katherine and Asher exhausted in new and profound ways. The first time Katherine felt the old suffocating panic, the feeling that she had been trapped by this small person who needed her so desperately, she took Thomas to Asher and said simply, "I need to fly a bird. Can you manage him for an hour?" Asher had taken their son without question or guilt-tripping, understanding that Katherine needed that connection to her old self and her freedom. She had taken Artemis out, flown her hard and fast until the Falcon was tired, and Katherine had remembered who she was beyond being a mother. When she returned, settled and whole again, Asher had simply smiled and handed Thomas back without a word about her absence. They learned to take turns, to give each other breaks and space, to ask for help without shame and offer it without resentment. They made mistakes regularly, moments of frustration or selfishness that they would apologize for and try to do better next time. But they kept talking, kept adjusting, kept choosing each other and their son with intention rather than simply going through the motions of family life. Thomas grew into a toddler who seemed to have inherited his mother's connection with birds and his father's easy charm. By the time he was 3, he could identify a dozen different raptor species by their calls and would spend hours watching Katherine work with the birds, asking endless questions in his piping voice. Asher taught him to ride almost as soon as he could walk, setting him on the gentlest mare and leading her in circles around the yard while Thomas shrieked with delighted laughter. When Thomas was 4, Katherine became pregnant again. This time, the news was met with less fear and more confident joy, both of them having learned they could navigate parenthood without losing themselves or each other in the process. Their daughter arrived in the winter of 1884, a red-faced screaming bundle they named Margaret Rose, after Asher's mother. Margaret proved to be as different from Thomas as 2 children could be. Where he was quiet and observant, she was loud and demanding. Where he gravitated toward animals and the outdoors, she showed an early fascination with books and stories. But both children grew up understanding that love did not mean ownership, that their parents would support them becoming whoever they were meant to be rather than forcing them into predetermined roles. The years passed in the way years do, quickly and slowly at the same time. The homestead expanded as Katherine took on more breeding and training projects. The ranch partnership thrived under Asher's steady management. Thomas grew tall and serious, becoming his mother's primary assistant with the birds by the time he was 12. Margaret grew sharp and clever, with a gift for numbers that had Asher teaching her ranch accounting before she was 10. On a warm evening in the spring of 1891, Katherine and Asher sat on their porch watching the sunset, a ritual they had maintained throughout all the years and changes. Thomas was in the mews doing evening checks. Margaret was inside working on some mathematical problem she had set herself, and the world felt peaceful in the way that only comes from hard-won contentment. "You remember the day we met?" Asher asked, his hand finding Katherine's as naturally as breathing. They were both 43 now, their hair showing threads of silver, their faces lined with age and experience. "I remember thinking you were presumptuous and probably insane," Katherine said with a smile. "Asking a complete stranger to teach you about love using falconry as a metaphor. What possessed you? Desperation. Asher answered honestly. And the sense that I had one last chance to figure out how to be the man I wanted to be instead of the one I feared becoming. Best gamble I ever took, asking you for help that day. Katherine squeezed his hand, feeling the familiar calluses and remembering when she first took that hand in hers and agreed to risk her heart. Best decision I ever made, saying yes. Though I spent half that first year convinced I was making a terrible mistake. Only half, Asher asked with mock offense. I thought I was more alarming than that. The other half I spent being absolutely terrified by how much I was beginning to care for you. Seemed safer to focus on your alarming qualities. They laughed together, the sound comfortable and rich with shared history. Artemis, now old and retired from hunting but still choosing to stay in the mews rather than face the wild alone, gave a soft cry from her perch as if commenting on human foolishness. She is still here, Asher observed, nodding toward where the falcon was settling for the night. After all these years, she could leave any time but stays. What does that say? It says that she has found something worth staying for, Katherine said softly. Safety and companionship and a partnership that honors what she is while giving her everything she needs. That is what we all want, really. Human or bird or anything in between. A place where we are known and valued and free to be exactly who we are. You gave me that, Asher said, his voice carrying the weight of emotion earned through years of shared life. That place where I could be fully myself, flaws and all, and still be loved. Where I could grow and change without fear of rejection. Where I learned that holding on and letting go are not opposites but partners in the dance of real love. Katherine felt tears prick her eyes, the good kind that came from happiness rather than sorrow. We gave it to each other, she corrected gently. That is the whole point. Not one person rescuing or teaching or fixing the other, but two people choosing to build something together that neither could create alone. The sun dropped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple and gold. In the mews, the birds settled for the night with soft chirps and rustles of feathers. In the house, Margaret called out a question about her mathematics, and Thomas answered with the patient tone of an older brother who had long since accepted his sister's brilliance. It was ordinary and perfect, this life they had built from a desperate cowboy's question and a falconer's willingness to take a chance. Years continued to unfold like the pages of a well-loved book. Thomas, at 20, decided to pursue medicine, his careful observation skills and gentle hands translating well to working with human patients rather than avian ones. Margaret, at 16, shocked everyone by announcing her intention to study law, determined to fight for justice in a world that still had far too little of it. Katherine and Asher supported both decisions without hesitation, even though it meant their children would forge paths quite different from their own. We raised them to fly free, Katherine reminded Asher when he grew melancholy about Thomas leaving for medical school in Houston. Cannot complain when they actually do it. I am not complaining, Asher protested. Just acknowledging that it hurts a bit, watching them go, even when I know it is right and good and exactly what should happen. Like releasing a bird you have trained, Katherine said, understanding completely. The joy and the sorrow all mixed together until you cannot separate them. That is parenthood, I suppose. Pride and loss and hope all braided into one complicated emotion. They stood together at the train station when Thomas departed, waving until the train disappeared from view, then returned home to a house that felt too quiet without his presence. But they adjusted, as they always had, filling the space with new projects and deepening their partnership in the way long-married couples do, when given time and intention. Margaret left 3 years later, heading to the brand new women's law program at a university in the East. She wrote regularly, long letters filled with observations about society and justice, and the slow progress of women's rights that had Katherine reading passages aloud to Asher and feeling fiercely proud of her daughter's sharp mind and sharper convictions. With the house empty of children, Katherine and Asher found themselves returning to patterns from their early years together. Morning flights with the birds, long rides across the ranch land, quiet evenings on the porch watching the sky change colors. They made love with the unhurried ease of people who knew each other's bodies as well as their own, finding new depths of intimacy now that they no longer had to be quiet or quick or interrupted by children's needs. On Katherine's 50th birthday, Asher surprised her with a gift that made her cry. He had commissioned a bronze statue of a falcon in flight, its wings spread wide, capturing perfectly the moment of launch when the bird committed fully to the freedom of the sky. The artist had somehow managed to convey both power and grace in the metal, and the piece took Katherine's breath away. "I wanted you to have something that represented what you taught me," Asher explained as Katherine traced the statue's wings with wondering fingers. "That freedom and love are not opposites, but complements. That the most precious thing you can give someone is the space to be fully themselves. You showed me that with your birds, and then you lived it with me every day for nearly 20 years now. This seemed like a pale representation, but it is the best I could manage." Katherine pulled him into a fierce embrace, her tears wetting his shirt. "It is perfect. You are perfect. This life we built together is so far beyond anything I ever dreamed possible that sometimes I cannot quite believe it is real." "It is real," Asher assured her, his arms tight around her waist. "We made it real by choosing it every day, even when choosing was hard, especially then." As they moved into their 50s and then their 60s, their life continued to evolve. Katherine's reputation as a master falconer had spread far beyond Dallas County, and she received requests for training and consultation from across Texas and beyond. Asher's partnership in the ranch had expanded to full ownership after his former boss retired, and he ran it with the same principles of fair dealing and respect that had governed his personal life. They watched with joy as Thomas established a successful medical practice in Houston, marrying a schoolteacher named Ruth and having 3 children who visited their grandparents' homestead, each summer with wide eyes and endless energy. Margaret, true to her word, became a lawyer and spent her career fighting for the rights of those without voices, never marrying but building a life of purpose and meaning that made Katherine glow with pride. On their 25th wedding anniversary, Katherine and Asher took a rare trip away from the homestead, leaving the birds and ranch in the capable hands of their employees. They rode into the empty prairie land south of Dallas, just the 2 of them and their horses and the endless Texas sky. They made camp near a creek as the sun set, building a fire and cooking a simple meal, talking and laughing about everything and nothing. When full dark fell and the stars emerged in impossible numbers, they lay back on their bedrolls and stared up at the cosmic display. "If you could go back," Asher said quietly, his hand finding Katherine's in the darkness, "to that day I showed up at your fence asking my strange questions, would you do it all again?" Katherine did not hesitate. "Every moment, every challenge and joy and heartbreak and triumph. All of it led to the life we built and the people we became together." "Why would you?" "Without question," Asher confirmed. "You saved my life that day, Kate, not in some dramatic rescue sense, but in the truest way possible. You showed me how to live with an open heart instead of a closed fist, how to love without fear, how to be free while being fully committed. That is the greatest gift anyone has ever given me." They made love under the stars, their bodies still familiar and desired after all the years, finding pleasure and comfort and connection in the joining. Afterward, they lay tangled together listening to the night sounds of the prairie, the cry of distant owls and the rustle of wind through grass. "I am glad you took that chance on a broken cowboy," Asher murmured against Catherine's hair. "You were never broken," Katherine replied, "as she had all those years ago. Just learning to fly free. And I am glad you asked me to teach you, even though I did not understand at the time that I would be learning just as much from you." They fell asleep like that, under the vast indifference of the stars. Two people who had found in each other the rarest of things. A love that liberated rather than confined, that honored individuality while creating unshakable partnership, that allowed both parties to soar while always providing a safe place to return. The years that followed brought the inevitable changes that age delivers. Catherine's hands grew stiff with arthritis, making the fine work of falconry more challenging though never impossible. Asher's back protested the long days in the saddle, forcing him to hire more help and accept his body's limitations. But they faced these changes together, adjusting and accommodating, never losing the fundamental respect and affection that had always been the bedrock of their relationship. When Katherine was 70 years old, Artemis died peacefully in her sleep, the old falcon finally succumbing to age after nearly 20 years in Catherine's muse. Katherine grieved deeply, mourning not just the bird but the symbolic loss of the creature who had been present at the beginning of her relationship with Asher, who had witnessed their entire journey from wary strangers to devoted partners. Asher held her while she cried, understanding that this loss touched something profound in his wife's heart. They buried Artemis in the meadow behind the house where she had flown countless times, marking the spot with a simple stone that bore only her name and the dates of her long life. "She stayed," Katherine said softly as they stood over the grave. "Every day for nearly 20 years, she could have left and she chose to stay. I hope that means we gave her a good life." "I know you did," Asher replied firmly, "just as I know that she gave you something equally valuable. She was the bridge between us, in a way, my lesson in how to love freely. I will always be grateful to her for that." They stood in silence for a long moment, honoring the passing of a small, fierce spirit who had taught them both more than either could articulate. Then they turned and walked back to the house together, hands linked, ready to face whatever came next with the same partnership and trust that had carried them through decades. Asher's health began to decline in his 73rd year, his heart growing weak and unreliable. The doctor in Dallas was frank about the prognosis. Time was limited, perhaps a year or two at most. Asher took the news with surprising calm, more concerned about Catherine's reaction than his own mortality. "I am not afraid," he told her that night as they lay in the bed they had shared for over 40 years. "I have lived a full life, been loved by the best woman I ever knew, raised children I am proud of. There is very little I would change, and none of it matters compared to what I got right." Katherine felt panic claw at her throat, the prospect of losing him almost too large to comprehend. "I am not ready," she whispered. "I thought we would have more time." "We have had decades," Asher reminded her gently. "More than many people get, and whatever time is left we will use it well. No regrets, Kate. We promised each other that once, remember. To live without regret, making choices with intention rather than fear." They made the most of the time they had, Asher growing gradually weaker but never losing his gentle humor or his fierce love for his wife. Thomas came home from Houston to help, his medical training making him invaluable in managing his father's care. Margaret arrived from the East, taking a leave from her law practice to be with her family during this difficult time. On a clear morning in late spring, with wildflowers blooming across the prairie and birds singing their territorial claims. Asher Irwin died peacefully in his sleep with Katherine holding his hand. She felt the moment he left, the subtle change in his breathing followed by profound stillness that told her he had moved beyond her reach. The grief was crushing, a weight on her chest that made breathing difficult and existing almost impossible. Katherine, who had faced countless challenges with courage and competence, found herself unmade by the loss of her partner. For days, she moved through the necessary motions of funeral arrangements and receiving visitors, but inside she felt hollow and lost. It was Thomas who finally broke through her fog of grief, taking her out to the mews one morning and pressing a leather glove into her hands. "Fly one of the birds," he said firmly. "Dad would not want you to stop living because he died. He would want you to remember everything he learned from you about freedom and choice and continuing to soar even when your heart is broken." Katherine wanted to refuse, but her son's words carried too much truth to ignore. She took one of the younger hawks, a bird she had been training for months, and carried him out to the meadow. When she launched him into the sky, watching him climb higher and higher into the endless blue, she felt something in her chest crack open. The hawk circled once, twice, then struck out to the south with powerful wing beats. Katherine watched him disappear, tears streaming down her face, knowing he might not return. She had trained him well enough that he could survive without her, which was always the goal. But watching him go felt like another loss, another goodbye she was not ready to make. She stood alone in the meadow for a long time, feeling the Texas sun on her face and the wind in her hair, thinking about everything Asher had taught her about loving freely and letting go. He had asked her once to teach him about freedom, but in the end, they had taught each other. Now he was free in the ultimate sense, released from the constraints of flesh and time, and she had to find a way to let him fly while still honoring what they had built together. The hawk came back at sunset, returning to her offered glove with a triumphant cry. He had hunted successfully on his own, proved his capability, but still chosen to return. Katherine fed him and settled him in the mews, feeling obscurely comforted by his decision to stay. "Asher would have liked that," she said aloud to the empty air. "Would have seen the metaphor in it. The hawk flew free but came back because it chose to, not because it was forced. That is what you always understood, love. That choosing to stay matters more than being unable to leave." She returned to the house where Thomas and Margaret were waiting, and for the first time since Asher's death, she ate a full meal and participated in genuine conversation. The grief did not lessen, but she found she could carry it without being crushed by it, could honor her loss while still continuing to live. Katherine survived 5 more years after Asher's death. Years she spent continuing her work with the birds and deepening her relationships with her children and grandchildren. She never remarried, never even considered it, feeling that what she had shared with Asher was complete and perfect in itself, and needed no sequel. On a morning in early summer, just after her 78th birthday, Katherine woke with a strange certainty that her time was almost done. She felt no pain, no particular symptoms, just a deep knowing that she would not see another dawn. Rather than fear or regret, she felt oddly peaceful, almost eager to see what came next. She spent the day doing all the things she loved best: flying the birds, riding slowly across the prairie land, sitting on the porch watching the sky change colors. Thomas and Margaret came in the evening, drawn by some unspoken summons, and sat with her as the stars emerged one by one across the darkening sky. "I am so proud of you both," Katherine told her children, her voice strong despite her certainty about what was coming. "You grew into exactly who you were meant to be, followed your own paths with courage and conviction. Your father and I did something right in raising you. You taught us to be free, Margaret said simply, to make our own choices while honoring our connections to others, to love without possessing and to live without fear. Those are not small gifts, Mother, Katherine smiled, taking each of their hands. Your father taught me those things first. He came to me broken and asked me to help him learn how to love without destroying. In teaching him, I learned it myself, and together we built something rare and precious. Now I get to go find him again and see what adventures wait on the other side. She died peacefully that night, slipping away in her sleep just as Asher had, her children keeping vigil beside her bed. In the mews, the birds stirred restlessly, sensing somehow that their keeper had flown beyond their reach. The hawk Katherine had been training gave a cry that sounded almost like mourning before settling back into silence. They buried Katherine beside Asher in the meadow, where she had released so many birds to freedom over the years. Margaret arranged for a bronze plaque to be mounted on a stone between their graves, inscribed with words she had found in her mother's journals. They taught each other to love freely, to hold without grasping, and to fly while always choosing to return. In this, they found the only freedom worth having. The homestead passed to Thomas, who continued his mother's breeding and training programs while maintaining his medical practice in Houston. Margaret, true to her fierce nature, ensured that both her parents' legacy and methodology were preserved in a series of articles. She wrote about their approach to falconry and the philosophy underlying it. The articles, published in various journals over several years, introduced a wider audience to Katherine's wisdom about freedom and partnership. Years turned to decades, and the story of the Falconer and the Cowboy became something of a legend in Dallas County and beyond. People told it different ways, sometimes emphasizing the romance, sometimes the philosophy, sometimes just the practical innovation of their training methods. But the core remained the same. Two people who had found each other against the odds, learned from each other with humility and love, and built a life that honored both connection and freedom in equal measure. Thomas's youngest daughter, named Katherine after her grandmother, became a falconer herself and took over the homestead when her father grew too old to manage it. She had inherited her grandmother's gift with birds and her grandfather's steady wisdom, and under her care, the mews continued to house raptors being trained, rehabilitated, or simply choosing to stay in partnership with the humans who respected their wild nature. On quiet mornings when the mist rose from the Texas prairie and hawks rode the thermal currents overhead, Katherine the younger sometimes felt the presence of her grandparents, as if they were still there watching over the place they had built together. She would take a bird out to fly, launching it into the limitless sky, and think about the lessons they had passed down through the generations. Love freely, hold without grasping, give space for others to be fully themselves. Build partnerships based on respect and choice rather than control and obligation. These were not just principles for training birds, but for living a life of meaning and connection. Her grandparents had proved it was possible, had left behind evidence in the form of decades of devotion, in children who had been empowered to follow their own paths, in a community that still told their story with admiration and affection. The hawk would circle high above the meadow, free to leave but choosing to stay, and Katherine the younger would smile and think, yes, this is what they meant. This is the lesson they wanted us to learn. That the best love, the truest freedom, comes not from absence of connection, but from connection freely chosen and lovingly maintained. That we can soar highest when we know we have a safe place to return. That letting go and holding on are not opposites but partners in the complicated dance of being human. The sun would climb higher, burning off the morning mist, and the hawk would stoop back to her glove with powerful grace, ready for whatever came next. And in the simple beauty of that moment, in the partnership between human and bird built on mutual respect and freely given trust, Catherine the Younger would feel her grandparents' legacy living on, teaching new generations the same eternal truths they had learned from each other all those years ago when a desperate cowboy asked a solitary falconer to teach him how to love. The homestead still stands today, maintained by descendants who understand its significance and honor what was built there. Visitors come sometimes to see the muse, to learn about the famous falconer and her cowboy husband, to hear the story of two people who figured out something most of humanity still struggles with: how to love deeply while respecting completely, how to commit fully while granting freedom, how to hold precious things with an open hand rather than a closed fist. And if you go there on the right morning, when conditions are perfect and the light falls just so across the prairie, you might see hawks and falcons dancing through the air above the meadow. Some are being trained, learning to hunt and survive and choose their own paths. Others are wild, never touched by human hands, simply following their ancient instincts across the Texas sky. But all of them fly free, which is exactly as it should be, exactly as Katherine and Asher would have wanted. Because in the end, that was their gift to the world: the knowledge that freedom and love are not enemies but allies, that the people and creatures we care for most deserve the space to become fully themselves, and that the greatest act of devotion is not to cage what we treasure but to give it wings.